I couldn't sleep that night, so I decided to go for a quick swim around midnight in the indoor pool at the hotel where I was staying. And honestly, for the first few minutes, it felt like the perfect way to clear my head. My name is Russell Hayes. I live over in North Carolina, and back in 2013, I was working as a corporate IT support lead. I was in my mid-30s at the time. I've always been a pretty practical, down-to-earth person. If something unusual happens, my first instinct is always to look for a logical explanation rather than jump to some weird conclusion. That's probably why this whole thing has stuck with me for so long. I've gone swimming hundreds of times in my life. Public pools, hotel pools, gym pools, you name it. But what happened that night in Florida is the only time I've ever gotten out of a pool feeling genuinely unsettled. Even now, all these years later, I still can't explain it. The whole thing started when my company sent me down to Florida for a 3-day IT training seminar. We were rolling out a massive software migration across all our regional branches, and as the support lead, I had to get certified on the new system architecture. They put me up in a really nice high-end hotel. I'd rather not name the hotel because the property itself did absolutely nothing wrong, and I don't want to unfairly associate them with what happened. So, throughout this, I'll just refer to it as the hotel. The training seminar itself was a real grind. It wasn't hosted at the hotel, it was at a corporate learning center about 40 minutes away. The routine for the first 2 days was a total exhaustion cycle. I had to wake up around 6 a.m. to catch the early corporate shuttle the company had arranged for us. We'd get to the training center before 8 a.m., and then we were stuck in these windowless conference rooms for 9 or 10 hours straight. It was a mix of intense technical workshops, deep dive troubleshooting labs, and absorbing a massive amount of dry compliance data to prepare for our certification testing. By the time the shuttle dropped me back off at the hotel around 7 p.m. each night, my brain was completely fried just from staring at monitors and absorbing data all day. If you've ever been on one of those intensive corporate work trips, you know exactly how draining they can be. On the third day, the instructors actually managed to wrap up our final testing and modules a little earlier than expected. The shuttle got us back to the hotel around 6:30 p.m. I was relieved to finally have some downtime. I grabbed a quick bite to eat from the hotel restaurant, went up to my room, and just wanted to unwind. I lay on the bed and watched TV for a while, hoping to catch up on some sleep. But for some reason, I just couldn't settle down. I was physically worn out from the past few days, but my mind was still racing. I lay there in the dark, staring at the hotel ceiling for a couple of hours, completely restless. Around midnight, I finally gave up on trying to force it. I got out of bed, threw on some shoes, and went downstairs to the designated outdoor area to have a cigarette. Standing out there in the quiet night air, I was thinking about the fact that I had a really early flight back home to North Carolina the next morning. I knew I needed to find a way to relax my body, or I was going to be an absolute wreck during travel day. I've been an experienced swimmer on and off for years, and swimming has always been my main outlet for stress. Standing there finishing my cigarette, it occurred to me that a quick swim might be exactly what I needed to clear my head and finally knock myself out for the night. I went back up to my room, grabbed my trunks and goggles, and headed back downstairs. Whenever I traveled and knew I was staying at a hotel with a pool, I'd usually throw a pair of trunks and goggles into my suitcase, just in case I found some free time to swim. Most trips, they never even left the bag. That night, though, I was pretty glad I'd packed them. It was right around 12:15 a.m. when I approached the front desk. I asked the guy working the night shift if the pool area was still open. He checked his watch and told me the doors didn't close until 1 a.m., so I had about 45 minutes. That was plenty of time. I told him I just wanted to do a quick few laps, and he said I was perfectly fine to head on in. The hotel had a really nice indoor pool setup. When I walked through the heavy glass doors, the whole area was well lit, clean, and completely pristine. It looked like any other hotel pool I'd ever used. Bright lighting, clean tile floors, a few lounge chairs around the edges, and not much else going on. When I arrived, one swimmer was already out of the water, wrapping a towel around his shoulders and packing his bag to leave. There was only one other swimmer left in the pool, just casually working through some slow laps. I dropped my towel on a lounge chair, adjusted my goggles, and slid into the shallow end. The water was a perfect temperature. The guy who was still in the pool finished up his lap, swam over to the wall near me, and pulled off his goggles to catch his breath. He gave me a polite nod. "Water feels great tonight," he said, wiping his face. "Yeah, it really does," I said. "I've got an early flight back home tomorrow and couldn't sleep, so I'm just trying to wear myself out." He gave a short laugh and nodded. "Smart move. Well, it's all yours. I'm heading up." He pulled himself out of the pool, grabbed his gear, and walked out. The heavy doors clicked firmly shut behind him, leaving me completely alone in the pool area. I took a deep breath, dipped my face into the water, and pushed off the wall to start swimming my laps normally. I did about 4 or 5 laps right off the bat, just trying to focus on my breathing and getting into a steady groove. The water felt great, and the physical movement was doing exactly what I'd hoped it would. It was taking the edge off that mental exhaustion from the seminar. My shoulders started loosening up, and I could feel myself finally starting to unwind after being so restless up in my room. After a few more lengths, the silence of the room really started to stand out. When you're swimming, most of what you hear is just the rushing sound of water in your ears and your own breathing. But every time I turned my head to take a breath, the open air in the room felt incredibly quiet. There was no background music playing, no noticeable hum from the air conditioning, just the dull echo of my own splashing bouncing off the tile walls. I finished a lap at the shallow end, gripped the overflow trough at the edge, and decided to take a quick breather before doing a few more. I pushed my goggles up onto my forehead and stayed there in the water, facing the wall, letting my legs drift loosely beneath me. I was there for maybe 30 seconds, just staring at the tile in front of me and waiting for my breathing to settle. When I heard it, somewhere behind me, further down the pool, there was a single, distinct swimming stroke. It was the sharp, clean sound of a hand slicing into the water and pulling through. The exact sound you make when you're executing a proper freestyle stroke. I snapped my head around immediately, but the surface of the water behind me was completely flat, except for the gentle ripples coming off my own body. I looked over at the deep end, then up at the metal ladders, and then toward the glass doors leading back out to the hallway. Nobody was there. The room was completely empty, and the doors were shut. I stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what it could have been. I figured it had to be an echo. Maybe a pocket of water had trapped some air under the pool edge and finally popped, or maybe the plumbing for the filtration system made a weird thud that sounded different through the water. I've been around pools long enough to know they can make some strange noises. I didn't see any reason to read too much into it, so I pulled my goggles back down, took a breath, and pushed off the wall to keep going. I did another 3 or 4 laps, but I'll admit I wasn't quite as locked into my rhythm as before. I kept catching myself glancing toward the walls every time I came up for air. Still, everything seemed normal, and the water was just as clear and comfortable as it had been when I first got in. I was about halfway through a lap, right around the transition where the bottom slopes down into the deeper section, when I swam straight into a localized patch of warmer water. It wasn't a subtle temperature shift either. It felt noticeably warmer than the rest of the pool, which had been completely consistent up until that point. Right at that exact same second, as my head cleared the surface for a breath, I caught a faint, unpleasant smell in the air. My immediate gut reaction was just pure disgust. I thought, did somebody pee in here? It's a gross thought, but it's the kind of annoying thing you half expect to deal with in public or hotel pools. But almost the exact moment that thought crossed my mind, I realized it didn't actually make any sense. The last guy had been out of the pool for several minutes already, and there was no reason one small patch of water should still feel noticeably warmer than everything around it, at least not that I could think of. That was the part that started bothering me. Up until then, I'd been able to brush off the sound of that earlier swimming stroke. Now I wasn't so sure. I stopped swimming and held myself in place in the middle of the lane, right on the edge of the deep end. I looked around again, trying to see if there was a return jet or some kind of heating vent on the pool wall that might explain why this one specific area felt different, or where that faint smell was coming from. I wasn't panicking or anything, but I definitely wasn't enjoying the swim the way I had been 10 minutes earlier. I stayed where I was, treading water, suddenly paying a lot closer attention to the empty room around me. After a few seconds, I turned back toward the shallow end and made my way to the wall. I wanted to shake off that uneasy feeling and get back into a normal rhythm. I kept telling myself that I was just overthinking things because I was tired from the whole seminar thing. I figured if I could just complete one final lap across the pool, I'd prove to myself that everything was fine, and I could finally go back upstairs and get some sleep. So I dipped my face back down and pushed off the wall into a standard stroke. Everything felt completely normal through the shallow end. But the moment I crossed the line into the deeper section of the pool, the water itself suddenly felt slightly heavier. At first, I figured it was just my imagination, so I just ignored it and kept swimming. I took another stroke, but the feeling remained. The water felt thick, like there was a bit more resistance than usual. I took several more strokes, focusing on my form, and started swimming a little harder to push through it. After a few more strokes, I looked up, expecting the opposite wall to be much closer than it was. It wasn't. I was still further back than I thought I'd be. I didn't think too much of it yet, so I dipped my head back down and kept swimming, digging my arms into the water. After what should have been enough strokes to put me right at the wall, I checked again. I still hadn't made the progress I should have. The wall still looked a ways off. Wait, what? That doesn't make any sense. I've been swimming for years, and I know how my body normally moves through the water. I'd already crossed that exact section of the pool several times earlier that night, and it had felt completely normal. Why did it suddenly feel different now? I decided to just force my way through it and get to the edge. I started kicking harder and putting a lot more effort into every pull, trying to brute force my way across. But the extra effort didn't change anything. Every time I turned my head to take a breath, I'd catch a glimpse of the tile markers on the side of the pool, and I was barely moving past them. It felt like I was completely stuck in place. I took 4 more long strokes, counting them out in my head, fully expecting to hit the wall on the final one. When I looked up, the wall still wasn't there. It was the most frustrating thing. I knew my arms and legs were working, but the water just wasn't letting me glide forward. The problem wasn't going away, and I had to put everything I had into another few clumsy, heavy pulls just to get close enough to reach the wall. When I finally lifted my head again, the wall was only a couple of feet in front of me. I reached out, grabbed the edge, and just hung there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I looked back across the surface of the pool, searching for some kind of logical explanation, but nothing in the deep end looked disturbed. While I was standing there trying to wrap my head around it, I completely lost track of time. I must have been resting against the wall for a couple of minutes before I finally looked up at the clock on the wall. I was surprised to see the display, which read 1:04 a.m. The guy at the front desk had told me the pool officially closed at 1 a.m. Seeing that it was already a few minutes past, I figured a member of the hotel staff would probably walk through those glass doors at any second to check the area and lock up for the night. Honestly, that was the exact excuse I needed to finally get out. The swim wasn't relaxing anymore. The whole experience had just become frustrating, and I was completely done with it. I placed my hands flat on the deck and pulled myself up out of the water, ready to grab my towel and head straight back up to my room. I stood there on the pool deck for a moment, just dripping wet and waiting for my breathing to settle back down. I walked over to the lounge chair where I'd left my things, picked up the towel, and started drying off, still thrown off by how exhausting that last length had been. My shoulders were aching a bit, but honestly, the mental confusion was bothering me more than the physical tiredness. I kept thinking about how perfectly fine the deep end had looked and felt during all my earlier laps, and I couldn't figure out why the water had suddenly felt so dense during that final length. I tossed the towel over my shoulder, gathered my goggles and room key, and got ready to head out toward the glass doors. As I was turning to leave, I casually glanced back over my shoulder at the pool one last time, just a habit before leaving a place. My eyes swept across the water, but then my gaze sort of snagged on the deeper section. Something about how the light was hitting the bottom looked just a little bit off. I paused near the chairs, just staring at the deep end for a few seconds. From where I was standing, it looked like there was a slight discoloration on the blue tile floor, right in the general area where that last lap had felt so incredibly heavy. I didn't think much of it at first, but I was curious enough that I didn't walk out. I set my goggles down on the lounge chair and walked a few steps back toward the edge of the pool, squinting a little to get a clearer look. The overhead lights were bright, but the surface of the water was still rippling and moving from me climbing out, which created all these shifting reflections and glares across the surface. It made it really hard to see straight to the bottom without the image breaking up. I figured it had to be a shadow from one of the ceiling fixtures, or maybe a reflection from the glass doors. I leaned forward slightly and shifted my position, stepping a couple of feet to the left to see if the dark spot would move or disappear when my angle changed. It didn't. It stayed exactly where it was. I stood there at the edge, looking down at it, trying to rationalize what else it could be. I thought maybe it was one of the drain covers, but then I looked a little farther over and could make out the actual drain covers off to one side. Then I thought, okay, maybe the maintenance crew had left something behind earlier, like a heavy pool vacuum head, a weighted brush, or some other piece of cleaning equipment that had sunk to the bottom. That explanation felt like it made sense for a second, so I leaned in a bit more, trying to trace the outline of it through the moving water. But the longer I stared at it, the more that idea started to fall apart. Whatever it was, it didn't look like pool equipment. The water in the deep end was settling down now, becoming smoother, but that didn't help me identify it at all. It was just a dark mass resting perfectly still on the tile, completely out of place in an otherwise spotless, brightly lit room. A really unsettling feeling started to creep up on me. My brain kept trying to force the shape into looking like something ordinary, but it just wouldn't fit. The room was dead silent except for the faint, steady hum of the filtration system, and knowing that I was entirely alone in this bright space made the sight of that motionless shape feel incredibly wrong. I felt this sudden, strong urge to just stop looking at it. I didn't want to wait around to see if the water would clear up any further, and I definitely didn't want to stand there anymore, trying to make sense of it. I took a step back from the edge, turned around, grabbed my stuff, and walked straight toward the exit. I didn't run or panic, but I didn't hesitate either. I pushed through the heavy glass doors, hearing them click shut behind me, and the transition back into the quiet, air-conditioned hallway of the hotel felt completely surreal. I walked down the carpeted corridor, got into the elevator, and rode it up to my floor without looking back. By the time I got into my room and locked the door, I was completely exhausted, but my mind was still racing, trying to come up with any logical explanation for what I'd just seen at the bottom of that pool. I stood by the door for a minute, my hand still resting on the lock, just listening to the absolute quiet of the hotel room. I was shivering a little bit, partly from the blast of the room's air conditioning hitting my wet skin, and partly from pure adrenaline. I walked over to the desk, set my room key and goggles down, and checked my watch. It was almost 1:20. I took off my wet trunks, threw them into the bathroom sink, and took a quick, hot shower just to wash the pool water off me and try to stop the shivering. After I dried off, I threw on a t-shirt and some gym shorts, sat on the edge of the bed, and just rubbed my face with my hands. Even then, sitting in the safety of a brightly lit room, my brain was still trying to find a normal way out of what I'd seen. I kept telling myself it had to be a trick of the light, or maybe some clump of debris that had somehow settled at the bottom of the pool. For a second, I actually thought about picking up the room phone and calling down to the front desk. But then I realized how ridiculous that would be. What was I even supposed to tell them? That I saw some dark shape at the bottom of the pool, but I had no idea what it was. I had no proof of anything, and the whole thing sounded completely crazy even in my own head. There was no way I was going back down there to check either. I just turned off the lights, got under the covers, and lay there in the dark. I didn't sleep well at all. I mostly just tossed and turned, drifting off into a restless, shallow sleep for maybe an hour or two before my alarm finally went off at 5 a.m. I got up, packed my clothes, and stuffed my damp swimsuit into a plastic bag. When I walked down to the lobby to check out and catch the airport shuttle, the morning shift staff was already at the desk, and guests were coming down with their bags for early flights. Everything looked ordinary, just another busy morning at a high-end corporate hotel. I caught a glimpse of the hallway leading toward the indoor pool area as I walked out, but I didn't go near it. I just boarded the shuttle, got to the airport, and caught my early flight back home to North Carolina. A lot of years have passed since that trip. I'm not in my mid-30s anymore, and I've moved on to different roles in my career since my days as an IT support lead, but to this day, whenever I find myself alone in a pool late at night, I end up thinking about what happened in Florida. I've gone swimming hundreds of times in my life, and because I'm an experienced swimmer, I know how pool water normally behaves. I know how sounds echo across an indoor pool deck, and I know exactly how my body is supposed to glide through a deep end. That's why the whole sequence of events that night still bothers me so much. When I think back on it, my mind just cycles through the details, trying to connect them in a way that makes sense. I still can't explain that single, distinct swimming stroke I heard behind me when the pool area was entirely empty. I can't explain that localized, warm patch of water and the faint smell that didn't have any logical business being there. And I definitely can't explain why the deep end suddenly felt so incredibly heavy and dense during my final lap, making me struggle just to reach the opposite wall. Sometimes I wonder if that dark mass had already been sitting on the tile floor the entire time, right from the moment I first walked into the pool area, and I somehow just missed it. But I always immediately shoot that theory down. I was wearing my goggles, my eyes were open underwater, and I had already swum back and forth through that exact deep section several times earlier that night without seeing a single thing out of place on the bottom. It wasn't there before, which leaves me wondering if it somehow appeared while I was in the water, or worse, if it was sitting directly underneath me during that final lap when the water suddenly turned heavy and wrong. I don't think I'll ever get an answer to any of it. I still don't know what I saw down there, or if the swimming stroke, the warm spot, the heavy water, and that dark shape were all connected. All I know is that it's the only time in my life I've ever left a pool feeling genuinely unsettled.